Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Global Voices Insights. My name is Eddie Avila. I'm the Managing Director of Global Voices. Global Voices is an international network of writers, translators, apologies. Um, okay, thanks. Start again. Welcome to the Global Voices Insights. My name is Eddie Avila. I'm the Managing Director of Global Voices. Global Voices is an international network of writers, translators, digital rights activists, and media partners who work to build understanding across borders. As part of the monthly Global Voices Spotlight series, we've organized this Insights webinar to kick off the series. Over the course of the next month, August, our editorial newsroom team and our lingual team will be working to help bring perspectives around this topic around Indigenous rights to a global audience. Indigenous rights are often reported on, but less often reported by the Indigenous communities struggling to exercise their rights, whether this is related to their land, access to resources, language and culture, and the right to freedom of expression and access to information. In today's session, we will explore how narratives around Indigenous rights are framed in the mainstream and digital media around the world, and the importance of self-representation and agency in telling their own stories and framing their own issues. We're very pleased to welcome three guests who have a local understanding of these conversations about how Indigenous rights are discussed within local, national, and global media ecosystems, and how issues important to the communities are portrayed, and about their own work through journalism, advocacy, storytelling, or media literacy. So I'd like to welcome first Lucas Kasosi. He's an Indigenous Maasai journalist and communications professional from Kenya. His work focuses on Indigenous rights, self-representation, traditional knowledge, environmental justice, and community-led storytelling. Through journalism and Indigenous media, Lucas works to amplify community voices and challenge narratives about Indigenous peoples that are often shaped without their participation. His work has been published by Cultural Survival and other platforms covering Indigenous rights, climate justice, conservation, and cultural identity. Next, we have Barsha Lecky. Barsha works at the intersection of climate change, biodiversity conservation, and Indigenous people, with over 7 years of experience across UNESCO, UNDP, and Indigenous organizations in Nepal and across Asia. Currently, she serves as Project Officer, Indigenous Engagement Specialist at UNESCO Nepal, leading the local and Indigenous Knowledge Systems program and working alongside government ministries, civil society, and Indigenous communities. Her work has taken her from community consultations in Nepal to international climate negotiations at UNFCCC, COP in Egypt, Dubai, and Baku. She holds a master's degree in environmental sciences from Jawaharlal Nehru University, India, and a personal commitment to the principle that no one should be left behind, not in climate or biodiversity policy, not in development planning, and not in conversations that shape the collective future. And last but not least, Valtz Ernstrates. Valtz is an Indigenous researcher, poet, and visual artist who has worked for decades at the intersection of language revitalization, self-representation, and Indigenous rights advocacy for Latvia's small Indigenous Livonian community, successfully building spaces for Livonian language use, educational, and digital and media presence, and driving community activism rooted in community perspective. His work also spans educating wider society and promoting Livonian-related themes and heritage across all levels of the educational system, as well as through media and state policy. He's actively engaged in advocacy and knowledge sharing on both sides of the dialogue, working from within Indigenous communities, while also serving on councils, institutions, shaping governmental media policy and its implementation. His perspective offers hands-on insight into the complex realities as viewed from both sides of the continent. So you see a very rich panel with lots of experience also from different regions around the world. And we'll jump right into the first question. We'll have a few rounds of questions and then hopefully open up to some audience members who are listening. Again, this is being streamed live on YouTube. The recording will also be available later on Global Voices YouTube channel. So I'd like to start with Lucas. This will be the same question for everyone, but in your experience, how are Indigenous rights issues typically framed by mainstream media in your country or region? And what do you think may be missing or distorted when Indigenous communities aren't the ones telling their own stories?
Thank you so much, Eddie. This is Lucas Kasosi. I am an Indigenous Maasai journalist and communicator based in Kenya. Thank you for your question. I think I will begin by saying that this conversation is bigger than media. It is really a conversation about power because whoever tells the story often shapes how the society understands the people in that story. So in my experience as an Indigenous Maasai journalist in Kenya, Indigenous rights issues are often framed through moments of crisis. The media tends to come to our communities when there is a land dispute, maybe there is a court case, an eviction, a drought, or a human-wildlife conflict, or something during maybe colorful cultural ceremony. Those are legitimate stories though, but when those are the only stories that uh, are consistently told, they create a very narrow public image of who Indigenous people really are. So the danger is that people begin to associate Indigenous communities only with conflict, poverty, resistance, or maybe tradition, while overlooking the full reality of our lives. They don't see Indigenous people as innovators or environmental stewards, educators, entrepreneurs, researchers, journalists, or communities with sophisticated systems of governance and knowledge that have evolved over generations. So one thing I have learned through journalism is that every story has two layers. There is the event of it, and there is the meaning behind the event. Mainstream media often reports the event, but Indigenous communities hold the true meaning. So if I can give an example, if there is a conflict of a land, the story may be reported as a legal dispute, maybe a development issue, or even a security concern. But for many Indigenous communities, land is far more than property. It is identity. It is a memory. It holds the spirituality of Indigenous people. It is livelihood. It is where our ancestors are buried, where our languages are maybe rooted, where our knowledge systems are practiced, and where the future generations will inherit the sense of belonging. So when that deeper context is missing, audiences just don't misunderstand the story. They misunderstand the rights that need to be defended. I also think there is another subtle but very important issue. Indigenous people are only included in stories as sources, but not recognized as experts. You will always see stories where government officials, maybe conservation organizations, or researchers explain Indigenous realities, while the while the Indigenous communities is given a very short quote near the end. But if you are talking about Indigenous land, Indigenous governance, the Indigenous knowledge itself, or Indigenous culture, then Indigenous people should not be the last voice, but they should not be the last voice in their stories, but they should be the first, because our lived experience as Indigenous people is expertise. So if I share a recent example, in 2024, the Kenyan State Department of Culture published when they were launching a public campaign celebrating Maasai culture, they used AI-generated images. At first, people saw it as a positive initiative, maybe because it appears to celebrate Indigenous heritage. But for us, the Maasai, the images immediately reveal something much deeper. One of the AI-generated images showed the Maasai man wearing a neck ornament that is exclusively worn by women. To someone who is unfamiliar with the Maasai culture, that might seem like just a minor design mistake. But for us, it wasn't simply maybe an artistic error. It was a cultural misrepresentation. So for example, ornaments are not decorative accessories. They communicate identity, gender, age, the social status, social responsibility, spiritual milestones, and maybe someone's place in the community. For example, the picture which was used, which is called Isuri in Kimasai, is traditionally worn by older women, and it reflects it reflects wisdom and leadership, while the emirage worn by young women symbolizes the fertility and the vitality. So these distinctions are not just fashion choices, they are part of a sophisticated cultural system that has been passed down through generations. So when AI or anyone unfamiliar with the culture mixes these symbols together, the culture is reduced to aesthetic instead of the lived knowledge. What may appear to be simple design mistake becomes a distortion of identity and meaning. So that experience reminded me that authenticity cannot be automated. Technology cannot generate, technology can generate images, but it cannot generate cultural wisdom unless indigenous communities are part or are involved. And I think that example really captures the heart of this discussion, where we are saying indigenous people should not only appear in the stories about our cultures, but we must also help shape those stories that are told. I've worked with cultural survival, where I had an opportunity to interview indigenous leaders from across Africa. And despite the diversity of their cultures and contexts, I noted that one common concern. Many of them were not asking others to speak for them. They were asking for the space to speak for themselves. That distinction is very important, because representation is valuable, but self-representation is transformative because it restores agency. So I've also seen in my own reporting, I did an investigative on illegal sand harvesting along Olkeria region, that is an indigenous Maasai land in Kajiado, where people could frame sand harvesting as an environmental or regulatory issue. But by spending time with elders, the pastoralists themselves, and the local residents, I realized the real story was about indigenous stewardship, the water security, the livelihoods, and the responsibility to protect resources for future generations. So maybe another challenge I could think is about extractive journalism. We always think of extractive industries taking resources from indigenous lands, but journalism can also become extractive, because reporters arrive when there is tragedy. They collect quotes and images, they publish their story and leave. So the relationship ends there. So communities rarely maybe have an opportunity to review how they were portrayed, to continue the conversation, or to benefit from the feasibility the story is generated. So ethical journalism should be relational. It should be relational rather than being transactional. It should also be built on trust, accountability, and respect. So at the same time, I don't believe this is the story of blame. There are many journalists who genuinely want to tell their stories well. I think the opportunity before us is to rethink how journalism is practiced, instead of reporting about indigenous people, or even occasionally reporting on indigenous issues. We should move towards reporting with indigenous communities. So that means building long-term relationships, recognizing indigenous knowledge as expertise, investing maybe in indigenous journalists, and understanding that language and culture are not just background details. They shape how people understand that world. So finally, I believe the greatest distortion is not always what is said about indigenous people. Sometimes it is what is left unsaid. When indigenous communities are not the ones telling their own stories, what always disappears is history, the context, knowledge, and the humanity. And without those, even a factually accurate story can fail to tell the truth. Thank you, Eddie.
Great. Thanks, Lucas. The same question to Barsha. In your experiences, how are Indigenous rights issues typically framed in mainstream media in Nepal or the region? And what do you think may be missing or distorted when Indigenous communities are not the ones telling their stories?
So For this question, I would like to drive my own experiences working in UNESCO, working in a developmental sector. As someone coming from indigenous community myself, so I belong to Tharo indigenous community of Nepal, and working in developmental sector, working with governments, indigenous communities, and international partners in the fields of climate change, biodiversity conservation, and indigenous knowledge systems. I often ask myself a question, even when we're developing a project or formulating like activities under any project for any project site, like who is developing this project, and are the ones who are developing for the ones are a part of the project development, have the project been developed in consensus and full effective participation of the people. So also, who gets to tell indigenous stories is also one of the question I ask myself, retrospecting my professional journey, because it this question is like shaping the perception, shaping the policy decisions, and ultimately, I would say the future of indigenous rights as well. Because in developmental sector, we keep on saying that indigenous peoples are beneficiaries. Often indigenous peoples are portrayed as beneficiaries and not leaders. Not as, like just Lucas mentioned, that indigenous peoples are custodians. They are the guardians of conservation and forest management. So across media platforms, I know what I've observed is that indigenous peoples are frequently represented as victims of climate change, guardians of forest, vulnerable communities needing assistance. But do we ask that what knowledge systems do they have that they have been tackling from generations, like before even climate change, came in place? What kind of food system, what kind of knowledge system, what kind of medicinal practice were they performing or following over generations? So while these narratives contain elements of truth, I would say these are still incomplete because they rarely portray indigenous peoples are the knowledge holders. They had their central of wisdom. They are scientists. They're like very off, like very little time we see that indigenous peoples are on the stage where they negotiate in the climate change conferences. How, so how do media see this as, when stories only focus on vulnerability, they unintentionally also impact the indigenous perspectives, I would say. So relating to the work that I do in developmental sector, I observe that indigenous peoples are subjects of development, and they don't, we don't see them as partners in shaping it. Rather than, it's a top-down approach where we create project and we're like presenting this project to this indigenous peoples and saying that okay, you are beneficiaries, and we report it like that. So but now, uh, the time should change. The developmental partners, the donors also need to change the lens of how we see indigenous peoples, how we see our community. So one of the biggest gap across, I think, media and the whole ecosystem is also about authorship. Like who is telling the story? Like in the newspaper, in the media platforms, in social media, we see different narratives. So who is actually writing the article? Also we need to introspect, because is it the same indigenous peoples who is going through all the all the impacts of climate change or biodiversity conservation writing the article, or is it the second person? Is it the non-indigenous people who are writing it? And also, were the consensus taken, were the consent taken prior to publishing these articles over media ecosystem, be it social media or like digital platforms or mainstream media? So this also matters a lot. And like what intention was of the documentary, or maybe the article or the web story. So I think it is high time that Indigenous peoples are not just subjected to interviews or surveys, but often, or not often, they should also given the platform to tell their own story. Um, so I think Indigenous youth should play a vital role. The Gen Z that we talk about should create their own narratives through social media platforms, and using their own language, like culture and the knowledge systems and innovative practices. And perhaps many Indigenous communities no longer have to wait for the mainstream media to tell the stories, because now in our hands we have phone, we can disseminate, we can communicate all these things through media. So that's all from my side, Eddie, for now.
Great. Thank you, Marcia. And we'll go over to Waltz. The same question about Indigenous rights issues framed in the media where you are.
Thanks, Eddie. So I maybe begin with the notion that I come from the region, which is Europe, the European part of Asia, Middle Asia, and up, which do not have maybe sufficient dialogue or understanding what being indigenous actually is. But what those my perspectives, I guess that they go also for other regions of the world. There's one small sentence that I noticed one time on social media, which kind of captured what I feel that what's wrong with mainstream media today, and it said, "You want our songs, but not our problems." So this is somehow what I feel, that once mainstream media starts to talk about indigenous people and indigenous issues, so it's always this kind of perspective when the majority is looking at something exotic, something that is peculiar, interesting for them, but kind of looking from the perspective. So these are not us. So this is something that we just want to tell you about, and basically all the narratives that take place in the mainstream media are concentrated about like what mainstream audience wants to hear and not what indigenous people want to say, and that is the actual kind of issue that I think that all indigenous people encounter. And along with that issue, so there are two things. So one is that perceiving indigenous people as something separate, something like kind of looking at indigenous people from that perspective and not giving the actual opportunity to speak to the indigenous people themselves, means that the marginalization is continued, and also kind of misperceptions are continued to be built. And we have had like several experiences of that kind. And we also feel that in a moment, if we as the people speaking from the behalf of the community, when we try to correct, when we try to interfere, when we try to point out certain things that we are not being heard, but and at the same time we are not just not being heard, but we might be even ignored. So I have received, for example, from our state media corporation, we had a situation when they made kind of a documentary depicting Livonians, and they took took some experts commenting and talking like very odd things or very odd theories about who we are, and there was not a single indigenous community representative on that show. And when we try to correct, when we try to point out that, well, this is not the right story that you told, so this is nothing to do with our actual lives and who we are and how we live, then we got complaints that we are trying to push upon this mainstream media our institutional kind of perception or institutional understanding, and there's kind of a media freedom. So this is one aspect that also is, and I was surprised by that. Media freedom is used to distort the perspectives of indigenous people, which shouldn't be there. But again, so this is the effect of the marginalization, in my opinion. So with that, with not providing indigenous people to speak about their problems and just relying on what kind of general public wants to hear, the core of everything actually gets lost. So, and especially because usually indigenous people are extremely underpowered in many senses, also underpowered in this media presence. So not being involved in creation of the narrative, not being actually, because indigenous people are not beneficiaries only. Indigenous peoples are actually right holders, and especially right holders when it comes to indigenous issues themselves, or their lives, or their community lives. So if they are not there, then we cannot actually have even a dialogue in a way as it should. So this is what, in my opinion, this is the key issue: the dialogue between on indigenous issues and between the indigenous people and majorities is being distorted by not involving indigenous people and not giving indigenous people opportunity to express what they feel and how they see the world. Thanks, Eddie.
Oops. Thanks, Waltz. Great. Thanks for the three of you to share your perspective on how this is playing out in your region. We heard about the challenges and also the pitfalls of not providing space, or for not recognizing that indigenous peoples are rights holders and need to be the ones telling those stories. And so want to hear from you as well of any examples or any initiatives, whether through journalism, storytelling, other types of media, that has been effective in being able to support indigenous peoples to tell their own stories, to frame their own narratives. I'll start with you, Lucas. Any examples that you can recommend or that you've seen firsthand?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Eddie and Fals. That
Lucas,
is
can you hear
really.
us? Okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah,
Hi,
do you want to
Eddie.
take that next question?
Okay. Thank you so much. So on how the indigenous communities are reclaiming their narratives, whether through journalism or maybe storytelling, I can say one thing that is most encouraging is the developments today is that indigenous communities are no longer waiting for permission to tell their stories. In fact, across the world, we are seeing indigenous peoples reclaim not just content of the narrative, but also the authority to define it. And I think that is a really very important thing as far as indigenous people are concerned. For a long time ago, many stories about indigenous people were filtered through the outside perspective, through foreigners. So whether through maybe government, the researchers themselves, the mainstream media, or rather the development organizations. So even when those stories were well oriented, they often reflected how others understood indigenous communities rather than how indigenous communities understand themselves. So what we are seeing today is a shift from representation to self-representation, and from being spoken about to speaking about ourselves. So that shift is much deeper than media. It's an expression of the principles of self-determination. So one thing I always remind people about is that indigenous people have never lacked storytelling traditions. Long before the coming of newspapers, television, or social media, Our communities had oral histories. We had songs, we had ceremonies, the proverbs, the storytelling around the fire in the evening, and elders passing knowledge from one generation to another. Those were and they are still very powerful forms of media. They preserved our histories, our laws, our values, and our relationship with the natural world. So one of the most effective tools in my own context has been indigenous language media. I have worked in indigenous language broadcasting radio, that is Paran FM, and I have seen firsthand how languages transform participation. You know, when a conversation happens in Ma, people don't just receive the information, they engage it differently. Elders contribute because they are speaking in the language through which they inherited the knowledge. So young people hear discussions that affirm their identity instead of suggesting that development requires abandoning someone else's culture. So communities ask questions, they challenge ideas, and share their local solutions because they feel ownership of the conversation. So that has taught me a very important thing, that language is not just a means of communication. It carries the world view. Every indigenous language contains ways of understanding nature, the community, and the governance, spirituality that can always not be translated directly into the dominant languages. So when indigenous languages are absent from media, we are not simply losing words, we risk losing an entire way of understanding the world. So I have also seen how community journalism changes narrative because first it begins with listening rather than assumptions. Community journalists are often part of the community they report on, so they understand the culture, the cultural context, they know the history, they have the relationship built on trust. That doesn't mean they are less objective. It means that they are able to report with greater depth and accuracy because they understand what is at stake. So those conversations reminded me that indigenous storytelling is not only about documenting suffering, it's also about documenting resilience, innovation, and leadership. Too often, indigenous peoples appear in the media only when something has gone wrong, but our communities also deserve to be seen as places where knowledge is created, where solutions are developed, and where hope exists. So another powerful development has been digital media. So today, many indigenous journalists, filmmakers, and young content creators are using smartphones, the podcast, the photography, documentary, and films, and social media to document stories that might never have reached the mainstream media. So a young indigenous storyteller in a remote community can now record an elder explaining traditional, maybe ecological knowledge, or document environmental destruction in real time, and share cultural practices with audiences across the world. So, of course, digital media is not a perfect solution. We still face challenges such as the unequal internet access. We have limited resources. There is algorithm bias and our representation of indigenous languages online. But what digital platforms have done is to reduce the distance between indigenous communities and the global audiences. So we no longer have to wait for someone else to decide whether our stories are newsworthy. At the same time, I don't believe reclaiming our narratives means isolating ourselves from mainstream media. I believe the future lies in genuine partnership. Mainstream journalism has reach and influence. Indigenous journalism brings the lived experiences, cultural understanding, and the community trust. So when those strengths come together with mutual respect, the result is more accurate and more ethical and really a very complete story. So for me, reclaiming narratives is ultimately about the reclaiming the right to define ourselves. It is about moving beyond being portrayed only through crises or stereotypes and being recognized as knowledge holders, the right holders and innovators, and also active participants in shaping our own futures. Because when indigenous communities tell their own stories, they are doing much more than correcting misconceptions. They are preserving languages. They are also protecting the knowledge systems. They are strengthening their cultural identity. They are influencing public policy, ensuring that future generations inherit not only the tradition, but also the confidence to speak in their own voice. And perhaps that is the most powerful form of storytelling, just not just simply changing how the world sees Indigenous people, but changing how the Indigenous young people see themselves when they grow up hearing their own languages on radio, seeing their own journalists on television, reading stories written by people from their own communities. They began to understand that they are not just part of history, they are holders of the future. Thank you, Eddie.
Thank you, Lucas. Same question to Barsha in terms of how are you seeing Indigenous communities reclaiming their own narratives, whether they're journalism, storytelling, or other types of media, and what's been effective from your point of view?
In terms of in terms I'm so sorry, like I had my sister in the background, so just distracted me. So in terms of giving examples, what we did is we had a Indigenous Youth as Researchers program. We call it UNESCO YAR, Youth as Researchers Project, where we collaborated with Indigenous organization, where the youth were combined with teams with different themes. For example, there were 4 themes. One was climate change, the other was biodiversity conservation, the third theme was on Indigenous cultures, and the fourth theme was on language preservation. So what we did is like we made a group of Indigenous youth who would do a research, and their research outcome will be disseminated by the way they want. So, for example, if they choose to write a report out of the research, some wanted to publish it in an article, in a journal article. Some wanted to video document the outcome of the research. So I think that could, I mean, like, you know, when we talk about media, it's not just about television or newspaper anymore. It's not limited, but now it's more open. Like, you know, it's opening doors in creative and innovative spaces, social media, and like podcasts and YouTube, and so forth. So all these, so we tapped upon all these new innovative ways, or like, let's say, media platforms, how these research products can be disseminated by the youth, by the Indigenous youth. So this we have been doing for past 3 years, and we're also trying to continue to support these Indigenous youth in communicating through media platforms about their research products. So yeah, that's what we've been doing. If I have to tell you about the example about our interventions in Nepal.
Thanks. Same question to Voss.
Thanks. I'll a little bit echo what my colleagues Lucas and Barsha already were talking about. In reclaiming their own narratives, I maybe don't have one concrete example. I will keep that for the next question. But reclaiming narrative is a common effort of the community, and it is a conscious effort that the community actually has to be ready to do. So I remember some of one Livonian elder who told me when I got angry, you know, in the situations when I heard something strange about Livonians, and I didn't want to talk with the journalist about this. Then the elder said, "No, you have always be ready to talk about who we are. You have always be ready to talk about what are our perspectives." And this is something that I do think this is a kind of a general strategy, unfortunately, general strategy that might work for Indigenous people, because as I said previously, so Indigenous people are under-resourced. They're under lots of pressures, but this is something that every community member should be ready to go for, and to talk and to take the initiative, to take the opportunity to speak, irrelevant whether the person is elder or a young, or someone very young. So just a couple of days ago, there were Livonian Festival back here where we are, and two young girls, age 7 and 8, were interviewed, and they did just that. So they went on the camera, and when they were asked, like, how do you like it here, they kind of used that opportunity to provide Livonian perspective on the camera. And I was really shocked that they are part of that reclaiming the narrative. But that's what I see. That's the strategy, the only strategy that allows indigenous people to balance out the non-existent resource with the resource that majority is having and will have. And of course, here in this process, the digital media, digital platforms, all the opportunities for digital expression is that have come actually to our help, including distributing and reclaiming narratives within the community, because that's one maybe aspect that is sometimes forgotten, that those narratives that are coming from the mainstream media or the majority part are eating up also those narratives within the community.
Thanks, Waltz. And I think just hearing the examples of those initiatives and your own experiences wants me to ask, in terms of any concrete examples that you've seen, how maybe this attention to intentionally support these storytellers. Have you seen any shifts in understanding, shifts in awareness around issues because of this? Maybe focus on supporting Indigenous storytellers to reclaim those narratives. Lucas, I can start with you again.
Well, thank you so much, Eddie. Yes, I think I spoke about the shift when I was talking about now the aspects of digital media, that today many Indigenous journalists, the filmmakers, the young content creators are using the smartphones to document stories that may never have reached the mainstream media or the mainstream newsrooms. So you find young Indigenous storytellers in remote communities now recording their oral stories through of elders sharing maybe traditional ecological knowledge and document environmental destruction in real time, or share cultural practice with audiences maybe across the world. So at the same time, digital media, as I spoke, that it might not be a perfect also solutions. We still find cases of unequal internet access. You find there is limited resources in terms of computers, the technological things that we are using, also the algorithmic biases and representation of Indigenous languages online. So for me, reclaiming these Indigenous narratives is about reclaiming the right to define our own selves, about moving beyond the beyond being portrayed only through crises or stereotypes, to maybe being recognized as knowledge holders, right holders, the innovators, and active participants in shaping our own futures. And perhaps also the most powerful form is storytelling, not just simply changing the world, how the world sees Indigenous peoples, but how Indigenous people themselves see themselves. So I think that is just a short thing on how we can shift narratives.
Barsha?
Yeah, thanks, Eddie.
Same question.
Sure. As I mentioned in my earlier intervention that we've been supporting Indigenous youth in doing their own research. So I think this way we can change the narratives, because the Indigenous youth, or let's say Indigenous peoples themselves, will be telling their stories, will be sharing their research outcomes. And this will help in shifting the paradigm about how earlier the non-indigenous, or like the ally of indigenous peoples, would do surveys and interviews, and then they would disseminate the product. But now it will be directly done by indigenous themselves. And I think moving forward, for future interventions, as developmental agency, we should increase indigenous ownerships of media. By saying this, I mean that we need to support indigenous journalists, filmmakers, YouTubers, like content creators, the podcasters, because like I think the medium of transmission of informations, of communication products, has been shifted, and we need to tap on to like content creators as well, because like how influential they are also depends. So like I think it's high time that we encourage our indigenous peoples and indigenous youth in creating contents, digital contents, and disseminate over their platforms, over their personal or like business accounts. And also we need to move beyond symbolic representation, where indigenous experts are in editorial position, where they get to decide what should go in the article and what should no, and like also supporting them in media leadership. So talking about what UNESCO is doing, we have been supporting indigenous journalists, by helping them disseminate wider audience about their products. We're also seeing at the intervention around the media safety of the journalists, and also we're also supporting the youth to do research. So I think these three areas is how UNESCO is supporting, and how we intend to support in future as well, where the leadership, or let's say the disseminators, are indigenous themselves. And it's high time that we need to support and promote indigenous storytellers, YouTubers, content creators, and so forth. So yeah, that's all from my side.
Thanks, Portia. False? Oops. Sorry.
Okay, thanks. I will share regarding an example, how the shift happens. I would like to share one case from back home. So there was approximately 3-4 years ago. So there was a long discussion over two years long about whether bilingual signage could be installed in Livonian former areas. So there was factually, so there is a law that allows something like that, but there was a big discussion also in media about whether that would be feasible, and all these other things. And but that is something that was is very important for the Livonian people, because it makes kind of Livonian language and identity of the area Livonians were living, and the land that Livonians were kicked out. So it kind of bring back the presence, and it was like very fruitless discussion on media, on state institution places. And then another language kicked in, language of the community, and the art object was made in and installed in the Livonian coast, in the area where those road signs should have been. And what this art object was pretty simple. So it contained two parts. It contained bilingual signage with all the Livonians crossed out with the black color. And there was a video telling about, it was called There Are No Livonians, with all Livonian mentions crossed out. And the idea was, through that performance, also to show people, to show state governmental institutions, to show the society that this is what you are doing with that discussion, was not kind of providing those road signs. You are, this is not inactive, but it is something that actively works against the Livonian community, against the Livonian point of view, and through this, like showing Livonian perception of that issue this way, and also motivating majority to put their names instead of Livonian written there, and try to imagine how it would be if the name of your nation or of your people would be crossed out, how that would feel. And that was the one thing that when it's got to the media, and it actually it spread very widely initially through the social media, but then afterwards also through the mainstream media. So it changed the situation that could not be changed for several years. So it changed in a week. So a week later, decision was made that yes, those road signs should be installed, and even more. So it led in the long run, just a year later, so it led to final understanding that state has to support Livonian language education, etc., etc. So that is maybe the way how, and I would say that in this case, and that is something that goes together with the previous question, that some kind of innovative asymmetrical actions in the media space are the ones that do help to reclaim the narrative, to reclaim the media space, and to get the perceptions and worldviews and all the things that are relevant to Indigenous people out to the broader society. Thanks.
Thanks, Waltz. I think we're almost at the end of time. I just wanted to thank everyone again for their participation. Again, this topic is very much in line with the work of Global Voices. Global Voices, we've been around for 20 years, and our mission has always been to amplify these voices. As I mentioned with the monthly spotlight, our regional editor teams are working with different groups, different community members to help them reach a global audience. So Global Voices has a newsroom and also a lingua project, which helps provide these stories in many different languages. So we're really looking forward to kind of the output of this monthly theme, this monthly spotlight. And obviously, many of you I've known through the Rising Voices initiative, which is part of this work of supporting communities to tell their own stories and recognizing that there are still lots of challenges, thanks to the work of all of you and many more people around the world. I think this topic is much more on the mind of many people, on many people of how do we support these communities to amplify their stories, whether it's providing training, whether it's providing amplification through other platforms, whether it's awareness building. So I just wanted to thank each and every one of you for your work. And maybe just as a final intervention, maybe 30 seconds, each of you, if you want to close with something, maybe a recommendation, maybe something you're hopeful for, something really quick to close us out, and we'll end right on before the hour. Lucas, any final words?
Thank you so much, Eddie. So let me just take you back about that question on the shift from who tells the story. One thing as a journalist I have really learned is that one biggest lesson I could say is that journalism has taught me is that changing who tells the story always changes the story itself, not because the facts change, but because the context, the priorities, and even the definition of the problem become different. So and I had mentioned earlier that I did an investigative story on illegal sand harvesting along Olkeria River in Kajiado through the support of the Cultural Survival Indigenous Journalism Fellowship. So when I went there, at first it looked like just an environmental story. It could easily have been framed as a story about mining or maybe some weak enforcement and natural resource management. Those were certainly part of the story though. But as I spent time with the community, listening to the elders and women, the youth and the pastoralists, I realized something important. The community was not simply talking about sand. They were talking about their relationship with the river. They spoke about They spoke about how the river had sustained them for generations, their families, how it had supported their grazing system, the wildlife, the medicinal plants, and the seasonal water sources. So at the end, the story stopped being only about the environmental degradation. It became a story about environmental justice, the indigenous stewardship, and the right of communities to protect the ecosystems. So just to close and to finalize, I could say that throughout this conversation, we have spoken about the media, the storytelling, and the presentation. This discussion has never just been about media. It has been about dignity, identity, and the justice. So the story societies choose to tell shape how people are understood, how policies are made, and whose knowledge is valued. That is why indigenous self-representation is not simply just a communication issue, but a human rights issue. Thank you so much, Eddie.
Any final words, Barsha?
As final words, I would just like to encourage the audiences to create your own stories. Take your phone, create contents of Indigenous peoples, and make your own narration of our worldviews, of our cultures, of our diverse language systems, knowledge systems. So I would just like to encourage the audience to help create our own narrative and like show the knowledge that we have. Thank you.
Thanks, Barsha. And Vols?
Thanks, and we will continue what Valsha already said. We will always, as indigenous people, so we will always need to fight the lack of knowledge in the society, as such. So the continuous marginalization efforts on different levels and lack of resources, of course, that's something that is crucially affecting all the indigenous kind of a media project. But the best recipe is what Barsha already said. It is create and innovate, and that's how we will together make it happen. Thank you, and thank you, Eddie, for making this happen as well. Teno.
Thanks to the three of you. Really appreciate your time and your perspectives. And we'll be seeing each other very soon. And thanks again, those who'll be watching the recording as well. And thanks for joining us on this Global Voices Insights on Indigenous rights and narratives. And again, please stay tuned to the Global Voices website for all our stories coming up this month. So thanks, everyone, and have a good rest of the day, afternoon, or evening.
Thank you, Eddie.
Thank you. Bye. Good